In the heart of the Amazon rainforest, where ancient traditions meet the modern world for the first time, a simple act of kindness can spark both wonder and fear. What happens when someone sees their own reflection for the very first time? What happens when that moment of discovery threatens to unravel centuries of carefully guarded customs? This is the true story of Dr. James Mitchell, an anthropologist who thought he was making a harmless gesture of friendship. He had no idea that giving a small mirror to a young native girl would set in motion a chain of events that would test his survival skills, challenge everything he believed about human nature, and ultimately bridge two completely different worlds. Some gifts change everything. Some moments of kindness create chaos before they create understanding. This is one of those stories where a single reflection in a piece of glass would reflect the clash between ancient wisdom and modern curiosity, between fear and fascination, between isolation and connection. The jungle holds many secrets, but none more dangerous than the moment when old meets new, and both sides must decide whether to embrace change or fight against it. Dr. James Mitchell wiped the sweat from his forehead as he pushed through the dense Amazon undergrowth. The humidity was suffocating, even at 7 in the morning. His backpack felt heavier with each step, loaded with research equipment, food supplies, and small gifts he hoped would help him connect with the indigenous people he was seeking. After 3 years of planning and 6 months of preparation, he was finally deep enough in the rainforest to find the tribe that had avoided contact with the outside world for generations. James was not like other researchers who came to study indigenous people. While many focused on their customs from a distance, he believed in building genuine relationships. He had spent years learning various indigenous languages, studying traditional customs, and, most importantly, understanding the delicate balance between observation and participation. His goal was simple yet profound: to document the daily life and cultural practices of isolated tribes while respecting their autonomy and privacy. The sounds of the jungle surrounded him as he walked. Monkeys chattered high in the canopy, exotic birds called to each other across the trees, and insects buzzed constantly around his head. Despite the discomfort, James felt alive in this environment. This was where he belonged, far from the concrete jungles of universities and research institutions. Here, he could study human culture in its most natural form. After walking for several hours, James noticed something different in the forest patterns. The trees seemed more deliberately arranged, and he spotted small markers that suggested human presence. His heart rate increased with excitement and nervousness. He had been tracking this particular tribe, known as the Kawahiva, for months based on satellite imagery and reports from other indigenous groups. They were one of the last completely isolated tribes in the Amazon, with no documented contact with outsiders. As he moved more carefully through the trees, James began to hear human voices. He stopped and listened carefully, recognizing some words from related language groups he had studied. The voices seemed relaxed and conversational, not alarmed. This was a good sign. He decided to make his presence known gradually, following the protocols he had learned for first contact situations. James found a clearing about 50 meters from where the voices were coming from and began to make small noises to announce his presence. He cleared his throat, rustled some leaves deliberately, and spoke a few words in the local language dialect he had learned. The voices in the distance stopped immediately. Then there was silence. For nearly an hour, James waited in the clearing. He knew that the tribe members were probably observing him, deciding whether he was a threat. During this time, he laid out some of his gifts on a cloth: metal tools, colorful beads, and small mirrors. These were items that many isolated tribes found useful or interesting, and they served as peace offerings. Finally, a young man emerged from the trees. He was probably in his 20s, with traditional body paint and simple clothing made from plant materials. He moved cautiously but without obvious fear. James remained seated and spoke softly in the indigenous language, explaining that he came in peace and wanted to learn from their people. The young man, who James later learned was named Tupi, seemed intrigued by the items James had laid out. After several minutes of careful observation, Tupi approached and examined the gifts. He picked up one of the small mirrors and looked at it curiously, clearly having never seen his own reflection before. The moment Tupi saw his face in the mirror was extraordinary. His eyes widened with shock, then confusion, then wonder. He turned the mirror around, looked behind it, then looked at his reflection again. He called out excitedly to others in the forest, and soon several more tribe members emerged, including children and elderly people. Among them was a young girl, probably around 12 years old, with bright, intelligent eyes and intricate braiding in her hair. Her name was Asha, and she seemed particularly curious about James and his strange possessions. While the other tribe members examined various gifts, Asha kept looking at the mirror that Tupi was holding. James could see her fascination and decided to make a gesture of friendship. He had another small mirror in his backpack, one with a decorative wooden frame. He pulled it out and offered it to Asha. She looked at her elders for permission before accepting it. The moment Asha looked into the mirror was magical and profound. She had never seen her own face before, except perhaps in still water on rare occasions. The clarity and detail of her reflection in the mirror was completely new to her. She touched her face while looking in the mirror, marveling at how her movements matched what she saw. She smiled, laughed, and examined every detail of her appearance. The other tribe members gathered around Asha, all wanting to look in the mirror. But James noticed that some of the older members seemed concerned. They spoke quickly among themselves in voices too low for James to understand completely, but their body language suggested worry or disapproval. An elderly woman, who appeared to be a respected elder or spiritual leader, approached Asha and spoke to her firmly. Asha reluctantly handed over the mirror, but James could see she was disappointed. The elder examined the mirror carefully, looking at her own reflection with a mixture of fascination and concern. James tried to explain that the mirror was a harmless gift, a tool that simply showed reflections like calm water. He demonstrated how it worked, showing them their own faces and the surrounding forest. Most of the tribe members seemed amazed and delighted, but the elders continued to look worried. As the day progressed, James was invited to visit their village. It was a remarkable settlement with traditional huts built from natural materials, organized in a circular pattern around a central fire pit. The tribe members showed him their daily activities, preparing food, making tools, creating art, and caring for children. James was careful to observe respectfully and take notes discreetly. Asha continued to show interest in the mirror throughout the day. Whenever the elders were not watching, she would ask James to show her the reflection again. She was particularly fascinated by how she could see herself from different angles and how her expressions changed her appearance. James began to understand that mirrors had a special significance in this culture that he had not anticipated. Through careful conversation and observation, he learned that the tribe believed strongly in the power of water spirits and reflections. They believed that seeing one's reflection too clearly or too often could be dangerous, potentially allowing evil spirits to capture or influence the soul. This explained the elders' concern about the mirrors. They were not just simple tools to the tribe. They were powerful spiritual objects that could have serious consequences. James realized he had inadvertently introduced something that challenged their traditional beliefs and practices. Despite the spiritual concerns, many tribe members were fascinated by the mirrors. Young people especially seemed drawn to them, curious about this new way of seeing themselves. This created a tension between traditional beliefs and natural curiosity that James could see playing out in the village dynamics. As evening approached, James was invited to share a meal with the tribe. They prepared traditional foods including fish, fruits, and vegetables that James had never tasted before. The meal was delicious, and the atmosphere was friendly, though he noticed that the elders continued to discuss something intensely among themselves. After the meal, the tribe members performed traditional dances and songs. James was honored to witness these cultural expressions and made mental notes about their significance. Asha participated in the dances, but kept glancing toward where James had placed her mirror among his belongings. That night, James was offered a place to sleep in the village. He set up his small tent near the edge of the settlement and prepared for the night. As he settled in, he reflected on the extraordinary day he had experienced. He had successfully made contact with an isolated tribe, witnessed their daily life, and shared in their customs. However, he was also aware that his gift of the mirrors had created some unexpected complications. Before falling asleep, James noticed movement near his tent. Asha approached quietly and whispered to him in her language, pointing toward his backpack. She clearly wanted to look in the mirror again, but was afraid of being caught by the elders. James understood her dilemma and quietly showed her the mirror one more time. In the dim firelight, Asha examined her reflection again with the same wonder as before. She traced the outline of her face in the mirror and smiled at her reflection. James could see that this simple object had opened up a completely new understanding of herself for the young girl. She was seeing herself as an individual separate from her community in a way she never had before. After a few minutes, Asha quietly returned the mirror and went back to her family's hut. James packed the mirror away and tried to sleep, but his mind was racing with thoughts about the implications of what had happened. He had witnessed something profound, a young person's first clear sight of herself, and the complex reactions this had triggered in her community. As he fell asleep to the sounds of the jungle night, James had no idea that this simple act of giving a mirror to a curious young girl would soon create consequences far more serious than he could have imagined. The gift that seemed so innocent and kind was about to test everything he thought he knew about cultural sensitivity, tribal customs, and his own survival skills. In the darkness of the Amazon night, with the village sleeping peacefully around him, James dreamed of reflections and wondered what tomorrow would bring. He had come to study and document tribal life, but he was about to discover that sometimes the act of observation changes everything for both the observer and the observed. James woke before dawn to the sound of urgent voices speaking in the tribal language. Something was wrong. He could hear the tone of distress and concern even though he could not understand every word. As he emerged from his tent, he saw several tribe members gathered around the central fire, engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion. Tupi approached James and explained in broken sentences mixed with gestures that there had been a problem during the night. Asha had become very sick after their interaction with the mirror. She was experiencing what the tribe described as spiritual sickness. She could not stop looking at her reflection in every surface she could find, including puddles, polished stones, and even the back of metal tools. James felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had not anticipated that the mirror could trigger this kind of reaction. As an anthropologist, he understood that introducing new objects or concepts to isolated cultures could have unexpected consequences, but he had thought a simple mirror would be harmless. The tribal elder who had shown concern about the mirrors the previous day approached James with a stern expression. Through Tupi's translation, she explained that Asha was under the influence of reflection spirits. According to their beliefs, when someone sees their reflection too clearly and becomes obsessed with it, the spirits that live in reflective surfaces can capture part of their soul. James asked to see Asha to better understand what was happening. He was led to her family's hut where he found the young girl sitting alone, staring intently into a small pool of water. She seemed completely absorbed by her own reflection, barely acknowledging the presence of others around her. Her mother, a woman named Kaya, was clearly distressed. She explained through gestures and the few words of Portuguese she knew that Asha had been awake most of the night, seeking out reflective surfaces and staring at herself. She had refused to eat breakfast and had not responded to her family's attempts to engage her in normal activities. James observed Asha carefully, trying to understand her condition from both a scientific and cultural perspective. From a psychological standpoint, it appeared that seeing her clear reflection for the first time had triggered an intense period of self-discovery and fascination. This was not uncommon when people encountered mirrors for the first time, though the reaction was usually temporary. However, from the tribe's cultural perspective, this behavior confirmed their worst fears about the spiritual dangers of reflections. The elders believed that Asha's soul was being pulled into the spirit world through her obsession with her own image. The tribal leader, an elderly man named Pakuri, called for a community meeting to discuss the situation. James was invited to participate, which he saw as both an honor and a responsibility. Through translation and his limited understanding of the language, he learned that the tribe was debating what action to take. Some members wanted to destroy all the mirrors immediately and perform traditional healing rituals to restore Asha's spiritual balance. Others were curious about whether the mirrors might have positive uses if handled properly according to traditional customs. A few younger members argued that Asha's fascination was natural and might pass on its own. James found himself in a difficult position. He wanted to respect the tribe's cultural beliefs and help resolve the situation he had inadvertently created, but he also believed that Asha's reaction was a normal psychological response that would likely fade with time. He tried to explain this perspective while being careful not to dismiss or criticize their spiritual beliefs. The discussion continued for several hours, with different tribal members sharing their views and concerns. James learned more about their traditional beliefs regarding reflections and spirits. According to their mythology, reflective surfaces were doorways between the physical world and the spirit world. Looking too long or too often into these doorways could allow spirits to influence or capture living people. During the meeting, Asha wandered away from her family's hut and found another reflective surface near the river, where her mother discovered her missing. The entire village mobilized to search for her. James joined the search, feeling responsible for the situation. They found Asha sitting by a calm section of the river, gazing at her reflection in the water. She was talking softly to her image, as if having a conversation with herself. This behavior deeply concerned the tribe members and seemed to confirm their fears about spiritual possession. When they tried to lead Asha away from the water, she became upset and resistant. She wanted to stay near the reflective surface and continue to be fascinated by her own appearance. Her family was torn between their love for her and their fear of the spiritual consequences of her behavior. James suggested a compromise approach that might address both the cultural concerns and Asha's fascination. He proposed that the tribe's spiritual leader perform traditional ceremonies to protect Asha from harmful spirits, while allowing her some controlled interaction with reflective surfaces under supervision. The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some elders thought it was too dangerous to allow any continued contact with the mirrors. Others were intrigued by the possibility of incorporating this new object into their traditional spiritual practices. Hakuri, the tribal leader, decided that they would try James's suggested approach for 3 days. If Asha's condition improved, they would consider the mirrors acceptable with proper spiritual precautions. If her condition worsened, all reflective objects would be destroyed, and James would be asked to leave the village immediately. The first day of this trial period was tense for everyone involved. The spiritual elder, a woman named Yara, performed purification ceremonies around Asha and the area where the mirrors were kept. She burned traditional herbs, chanted protective prayers, and created spiritual barriers using symbols drawn in the earth. Under this spiritual protection, Asha was allowed to look in the mirror for short periods while Yara supervised. James observed these sessions carefully, noting both Asha's reactions and the cultural practices surrounding the ritual. What he saw was fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Asha's intense fascination with her reflection began to moderate under the structured conditions. When her mirror time was limited and surrounded by spiritual ceremony, she seemed more able to engage with other activities and people. However, tension was building in the village. Some tribe members blamed James for bringing danger to their community. Others were becoming curious about the mirrors and wanted to try using them under similar spiritual protections. The introduction of this new object was creating divisions and discussions that had never existed before. James realized that his simple gift had triggered a complex cultural crisis. The tribe was being forced to adapt their traditional beliefs and practices to accommodate a new reality. This was exactly the kind of cultural disruption that anthropologists were trained to avoid. On the second day of the trial period, the situation became more complicated. Other young people in the tribe began showing interest in the mirrors, despite their parents' concerns. A teenage boy named Maku asked to participate in the supervised mirror sessions with Asha. The elders were divided about this request. Some saw it as evidence that the mirror spirits were spreading their influence to other tribal members. Others viewed it as natural curiosity that could be managed through traditional spiritual practices. James found himself becoming more deeply involved in tribal decision-making than he had ever intended. His academic background and understanding of other cultures gave him insights that the tribe found valuable, but he was careful to present his views as suggestions rather than demands. During this time, he also learned more about the individual tribal members and their different personalities and perspectives. Asha's mother, Kaya, was revealed to be someone who often questioned traditional practices and was more open to new ideas. Her husband, Nalu, was more conservative and worried about maintaining cultural traditions. The teenage boy Maka was known in the tribe as someone who often pushed boundaries and tested limits. His interest in the mirrors was seen by some as typical rebellious behavior, while others viewed it as a sign that the spiritual dangers were real and spreading. James spent hours each day documenting these cultural dynamics and personal interactions. He was witnessing firsthand how communities adapt to change and how individual personalities influence collective decisions. It was exactly the kind of anthropological research he had hoped to conduct, though not under these circumstances. As the second day ended, Yara reported that Asha seemed to be improving under the spiritual protection protocols. She was eating normally again and participating in family activities, though she still showed strong interest in the mirror during her supervised sessions. However, that night, James was awakened by angry voices outside his tent. A group of tribal members were arguing about whether to continue the trial period or end it immediately. Some had noticed that Maku had been trying to see his reflection in various surfaces around the village, despite not being given permission to use the mirrors. The debate that night was more intense than before. James could understand enough of the language to know that some people were calling him a bringer of spiritual danger who should be banished from the village immediately. Others defended him as a friend who had made an innocent mistake and was trying to help fix the situation. The discussion continued until dawn, with different tribal members expressing their fears, concerns, and hopes. James lay in his tent listening to the passionate debates about tradition versus curiosity, safety versus exploration, and the role of outsiders in their community. By morning, he realized that the simple act of giving a mirror to a young girl had exposed deeper tensions within the tribe about how to deal with the outside world. His presence had forced them to confront questions about change, adaptation, and cultural preservation that they might have preferred to avoid. As the third and final day of the trial period began, James knew that the decision about the mirrors would determine not only Asha's fate, but also his own future with the tribe and possibly his entire research project. The gift that had seemed so innocent had become a test of cultural flexibility, spiritual beliefs, and community solidarity. The jungle around them continued its ancient rhythms, but within the village, everything was changing. James prepared for what might be his last day with the Kawahiva people, hoping that somehow the situation could be resolved in a way that respected both their traditions and their natural human curiosity about themselves and their world. The third day began with an unexpected development that changed everything. James was awakened not by argument, but by the sound of celebration. Confused, he emerged from his tent to find the village in a state of excitement he had not seen before. Asha was in the center of the village, demonstrating something remarkable to a gathered crowd. She was using her mirror not just to look at herself, but to redirect sunlight into dark corners of huts, to signal to people across distances, and to start fires by focusing the sun's rays. Somehow, during the night, she had discovered practical applications for the mirror that went far beyond simple reflection. James watched in amazement as Asha showed the tribal elders how the mirror could be used as a tool. She demonstrated how reflected sunlight could illuminate the interior of storage huts that were normally dark, making it easier to find specific items. She showed how the mirror could create bright flashes of light that could be seen from far away, potentially useful for communication or signaling. Most impressively, she had figured out how to use the mirror to concentrate sunlight into a focused beam hot enough to start fires. This was particularly valuable because the tribe traditionally started fires using friction methods that were time-consuming and difficult in humid conditions. The transformation in the village's attitude was dramatic. The same elders who had been concerned about spiritual dangers the day before were now examining the mirror with intense practical interest. They began discussing how this tool could be integrated into their daily lives and traditional practices. Hakuri, the tribal leader, approached James with an expression of respect and curiosity rather than suspicion. Through translation, he explained that Asha's discoveries had revealed the true nature of the mirror gift. Rather than being purely a spiritual object that captured souls, it was also a powerful tool that could improve their daily lives. However, this realization created new discussions about proper protocols for using mirrors. The elders wanted to establish rules and ceremonies that would allow them to gain the practical benefits while maintaining spiritual protection from any harmful effects. James found himself in the unique position of being asked to help develop these new cultural practices. The tribe wanted to understand more about how mirrors worked scientifically, so they could create appropriate spiritual frameworks for their use. Over several hours, James explained the basic physics of reflection, refraction, and light focus. He showed them how different angles and positions could create different effects with the mirror. He also shared knowledge about how other cultures around the world had traditionally used reflective objects for both practical and spiritual purposes. The tribe members were fascinated by these explanations. Many of them quickly grasped the scientific principles and began experimenting with different ways to use the mirrors. Young people especially showed remarkable creativity in discovering new applications for the reflective surfaces. Maku, the teenage boy who had been seeking his own reflection, became particularly skilled at using mirrors for communication. He developed a system of light signals that could convey basic messages across the forest canopy. This impressed the adult hunters, who saw immediate applications for coordinating during hunting expeditions. Other young people discovered that mirrors could be used to observe wildlife without disturbing animals. By positioning mirrors carefully, they could watch birds and small mammals that would normally flee from direct human presence. This opened up new possibilities for learning about animal behavior and improving hunting strategies. The practical applications began to multiply as more tribe members experimented with the mirrors. They found ways to use reflected light for detailed craftwork that was difficult in a dim forest environment. They discovered that mirrors could help them examine hard-to-see areas like the inside of tree cavities or underwater spaces. James documented these innovations carefully, realizing that he was witnessing an accelerated process of technological adaptation. The tribe was not simply adopting a foreign tool. They were integrating it into their existing knowledge systems and cultural practices in creative ways that he had never seen before. However, the spiritual concerns had not disappeared entirely. Yara, the spiritual elder, continued to insist that proper ceremonies and protections were necessary when using mirrors. She developed new rituals that combined traditional spiritual practices with the practical applications the young people had discovered. These new ceremonies were fascinating to observe. Before using mirrors for any purpose, tribe members would perform brief purification rituals and recite protective prayers. The mirrors themselves were blessed with traditional herbs and stored in special containers when not in use. The integration of spiritual protection with practical innovation created a unique cultural adaptation that honored both traditional beliefs and new possibilities. James realized he was witnessing something remarkable, a demonstration of how indigenous cultures could maintain their spiritual integrity while embracing beneficial technologies. As the day progressed, more tribal members requested opportunities to learn mirror techniques. Parents who had been worried about spiritual dangers began asking for their children to be trained in proper mirror use. The tool that had initially created division was becoming a source of community interest and cooperation. The change in attitude toward James was equally dramatic. Instead of being viewed as a bringer of spiritual danger, he was now seen as someone who had brought them a valuable gift. Tribal members began approaching him with questions about other tools and technologies that might be useful to their community. This shift created new responsibilities and ethical considerations for James. As an anthropologist, his goal was to study and document existing cultures, not to change or modernize them. However, the tribe was actively seeking his knowledge about the outside world and asking for his help in evaluating what might be beneficial for their community. James spent considerable time thinking about how to handle this situation responsibly. He wanted to be helpful without imposing outside values or encouraging changes that might ultimately harm their traditional way of life. He decided to focus on providing factual information while emphasizing that all decisions about what to adopt or reject should be made by the tribal community according to their own values and priorities. During the afternoon, Pakuri called for another community meeting to formally discuss the status of the mirrors and James's continued presence in the village. The tone of this meeting was completely different from the previous discussions. Instead of debate about dangers and risks, the conversation focused on opportunities and protocols. The tribal council decided unanimously that mirrors would be accepted as beneficial tools for the community. However, they established strict guidelines for their use, combining practical training with spiritual protection. Only certain tribal members would be authorized to use mirrors for specific purposes, and all mirror use would be supervised by spiritual elders. They also decided that James would be welcome to stay in the village for an extended period to continue his research and to help them evaluate other potentially useful technologies. This was an extraordinary honor, as the tribe had never before invited an outsider to become a long-term community member. James accepted this invitation with gratitude and a deep sense of responsibility. He realized that his role had evolved from outside observer to cultural bridge between the tribal community and the wider world. This was both an incredible opportunity and a significant challenge. That evening, the village held a celebration feast to mark the resolution of the mirror crisis and to welcome James as an extended community member. Traditional foods were prepared, ceremonial dances were performed, and stories were shared that explained how the community had successfully navigated a potentially dangerous situation. Asha was honored during the celebration as the person who had discovered the beneficial uses of mirrors. Her initial spiritual crisis had led to innovations that would benefit the entire community. The experience had transformed her from someone who was seen as spiritually endangered to someone who was recognized as a creative problem solver. During the feast, James reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had unfolded. His simple gift of a mirror had triggered a complex cultural crisis that ultimately strengthened the community and opened new possibilities for their future. The experience had taught him important lessons about the unpredictable nature of cultural contact and the remarkable adaptability of human societies. As the celebration continued into the night, James began to understand that his relationship with the Kawahiva people had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a researcher studying their culture. He had become part of their ongoing story of adaptation and growth. The mirror that had initially seemed to threaten their traditional way of life had instead become a symbol of their ability to embrace beneficial changes while maintaining their cultural identity. James realized that he had witnessed something profound, a demonstration of cultural resilience and wisdom that would influence his understanding of human societies for the rest of his career. As he fell asleep that night, surrounded by the sounds of the celebrating village, James felt grateful for the opportunity to witness and participate in this remarkable process of cultural adaptation. The young girl's first glimpse of herself in a mirror had opened up new possibilities not just for her individual self-understanding, but for her entire community's relationship with the changing world around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight the village celebrated their successful navigation of change and their continued strength as a unified community. The mirror crisis had ended not with rejection or acceptance, but with the kind of thoughtful integration that represented the best of human wisdom and adaptability. 3 weeks had passed since the mirror celebration, and James had settled into a daily routine with the Kawahiva people. His small research cabin, built with help from tribal members using traditional techniques, sat at the edge of the village. Each morning, he would wake to the sounds of the forest and the gentle activities of tribal life beginning around him. James had become much more than an observer. The tribal council had formally appointed him as a cultural advisor, someone who could help them evaluate contacts with the outside world and assess new technologies or ideas that might benefit their community. This role came with significant responsibilities and a deep sense of trust from the tribal members. Asha had become his most frequent visitor and informal teaching assistant. Her natural curiosity and quick learning had made her skilled not only with mirrors but with many of the research tools James carried. She helped him document plant species, record traditional stories, and translate complex cultural concepts between her language and his. The success with mirrors had opened up broader discussions about selective adoption of outside technologies. The tribal council was interested in learning about medical knowledge, agricultural techniques, and communication methods that might improve their quality of life without compromising their cultural independence. James approached these requests carefully, always emphasizing that any decisions about change should be made by the community according to their own values and priorities. He provided information about how different technologies worked and how other indigenous communities had successfully integrated them, but he refused to make recommendations about what the Kawahiva should or should not adopt. One morning, James was working in his cabin when he heard unusual commotion from the direction of the village. Voices were raised in what sounded like alarm rather than celebration. He quickly gathered his medical supplies and headed toward the noise, unsure what emergency might be unfolding. What he found was not a medical crisis, but something far more complex. A small group of strangers had appeared at the edge of the village. 3 men and 1 woman, all carrying modern equipment and wearing clothing that marked them as outsiders from the developed world. James recognized them immediately as researchers or possibly government officials. Their presence represented exactly the kind of outside contact that the Kawahiva had been avoiding for generations. His heart sank as he realized that his own presence in the village might have somehow led these people to the tribal location. Pakiri approached James with a serious expression and explained the situation through Tupi's translation. The strangers claimed to be government scientists conducting a census of indigenous populations for legal protection purposes. They had tracking equipment and seemed to know exactly where they were going, which suggested they had been monitoring the village location for some time. The tribal council was meeting in emergency session to decide how to respond to this unexpected contact. Some members wanted to retreat deeper into the forest and abandon their current village site. Others argued for cautious engagement to learn what the strangers wanted. A few suggested that James should act as an intermediary since he understood both cultures. James felt a deep sense of responsibility for this crisis. While he had been extremely careful to avoid revealing the tribe's location to anyone, he realized that his own expedition might have been tracked by satellite or other monitoring systems. Government agencies and research institutions sometimes monitored anthropological work in remote areas, especially when it involved previously uncontacted tribes. The lead stranger, who introduced himself as Dr. Rodriguez from the Brazilian Indigenous Affairs Foundation, explained that they had been tracking illegal logging activities in the region and had discovered evidence of the village through satellite imagery. They claimed their purpose was to establish legal protections for the tribal territory and to offer medical and educational services. James found himself in an impossible position. As someone who understood both indigenous rights and government bureaucracy, he could see that Dr. Rodriguez's claims might be legitimate. Legal protection for tribal lands was indeed important, and medical services could be life-saving. However, he also knew that government contact often led to cultural disruption and loss of autonomy for indigenous communities. The tribal council asked James to participate in negotiations with the government team. This was an extraordinary responsibility that he had never anticipated. His anthropological training had not prepared him for serving as a diplomatic intermediary between an isolated tribe and government officials. The negotiations took place in the village center, with the entire community gathered to observe. Dr. Rodriguez presented documents showing illegal logging activities that were approaching the tribal territory and explained how government recognition could provide legal protection against these threats. James translated these explanations carefully, making sure that tribal members understood both the potential benefits and risks of government involvement. He explained how legal recognition worked, what kinds of services might be offered, and what obligations or restrictions might come with official status. The tribal reaction was mixed and intense. Older members were generally skeptical of any government involvement, remembering stories passed down from previous generations about negative consequences of outside contact. Younger members were more curious about potential benefits like medical care and educational opportunities. Asha, now recognized as one of the tribe's innovative thinkers, asked particularly insightful questions about how legal recognition might affect their traditional practices and decision-making authority. Her experience with the mirrors had taught her to think carefully about both benefits and risks of new developments. Dr. Rodriguez seemed genuinely surprised by the sophistication of the tribal council's questions and their obvious familiarity with complex issues through James's previous explanations. He admitted that most first contact situations he had experienced involved communities with less preparation for dealing with government bureaucracy. The negotiations continued for 3 days, with James serving as translator and cultural interpreter for both sides. He worked to ensure that tribal members fully understood the implications of different options, while helping government officials appreciate the community's values and concerns. During this time, James learned more about the external pressures facing the Kawahiva people. Illegal logging was indeed approaching their territory, driven by international demand for hardwood and agricultural land. Mining companies were also exploring the region for mineral deposits. Without legal protection, the tribe's traditional lands could be overrun by these commercial activities. However, government recognition came with requirements for regular contact, health monitoring, educational programs, and integration into national census systems. These requirements could fundamentally alter the tribe's isolated lifestyle and traditional governance structures. James realized that his role as cultural bridge had evolved into something much more significant. The decisions made during these negotiations would determine the future of the Kawahiva people and their relationship with the outside world. The responsibility was overwhelming. On the third night of negotiations, Pakuri asked James to participate in a private tribal council meeting without the government officials. The elders wanted his honest assessment of the situation and his recommendations for how to proceed. James spent hours explaining the complex realities of indigenous rights law, the history of government interactions with tribal communities, and the various options available to the Kawahiva people. He tried to present balanced information while being honest about both positive and negative possibilities. The tribal council's discussion that night was one of the most profound conversations James had ever witnessed. Community members shared their deepest fears and hopes, their understanding of traditional values, and their concerns about future generations. The level of wisdom and thoughtfulness in their deliberations was extraordinary. By dawn, the tribal council had reached a preliminary decision. They would accept limited government recognition for land protection purposes, but with strict conditions about maintaining their autonomy in cultural and spiritual matters. They wanted legal protection against logging and mining without surrendering their right to control access to their community. James helped negotiate the specific terms of this arrangement with Dr. Rodriguez's team. The final agreement included legal recognition of tribal territory, protection against commercial exploitation, and access to emergency medical services, while preserving the community's right to limit outside contact and maintain traditional governance systems. The agreement also included provisions for James to continue his role as cultural advisor and intermediary, helping the tribe navigate future contacts with the outside world. This formalized his position in a way that provided both the community and government officials with clear expectations for ongoing relationships. As Dr. Rodriguez's team prepared to leave, they expressed genuine respect for the tribal community's sophisticated approach to the negotiation process. They admitted that the Kawahiva people had been better prepared for government contact than most indigenous communities, largely due to James's cultural education work over the previous months. After the government officials departed, the village held another ceremony to mark this major transition in their relationship with the outside world. The ceremony honored both their traditional values and their ability to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their cultural integrity. Asha played a special role in the ceremony, using mirrors to create symbolic patterns of light that represented the community's ability to reflect on challenges and redirect them into opportunities. The mirrors had become symbols not just of self-awareness, but of cultural wisdom and adaptability. James realized that his simple gift of a mirror to a curious young girl had initiated a series of changes that culminated in the tribe's successful navigation of first contact with the modern world. The crisis that had seemed so dangerous a few weeks earlier had actually prepared the community for this much more significant challenge. As he settled into his cabin that evening, James reflected on the extraordinary journey from anthropological researcher to cultural advisor to diplomatic intermediary. His relationship with the Kawahiva people had evolved in ways he never could have anticipated, and his understanding of cultural adaptation had been transformed by witnessing their remarkable resilience and wisdom. The mirror that had started everything sat on his desk, reflecting the candlelight and the face of someone who was no longer just an observer of indigenous culture, but had become part of an ongoing story of cultural survival and adaptation in an increasingly connected world. 2 years had passed since the government negotiations, and the village had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. James's cabin had become a permanent fixture at the edge of the settlement, surrounded by gardens where he grew vegetables using seeds provided by the tribal members and techniques learned from their agricultural knowledge. The legal protection for tribal lands had proven effective. Several attempts by logging companies to enter the territory had been blocked by government enforcement of the protection agreements. Mining exploration permits had been denied based on the legal recognition of indigenous land rights. The community had successfully maintained control over their territory while gaining protection against external commercial threats. Asha, now 14, had become the village's expert in what they called reflection technology. Her innovations with mirrors had expanded far beyond the original applications. She had developed techniques for using multiple mirrors to create complex lighting systems for indoor spaces, communication networks that could span several kilometers through the forest canopy, and even artistic installations that created beautiful patterns of light during ceremonies. More importantly, Asha had become a bridge between traditional knowledge and new possibilities. She worked with elders to document traditional stories and practices while also experimenting with new ways to preserve and share cultural knowledge. Her unique perspective, shaped by her experience with first seeing her reflection, had given her insights into both individual identity and community belonging that benefited the entire village. James's role as cultural advisor had expanded to include several neighboring indigenous communities who had learned about the Kawahiva's successful approach to outside contact. He now spent part of each month traveling to other villages, helping them develop strategies for protecting their lands and cultures while selectively adopting beneficial technologies. This broader work had given James a deep understanding of the challenges facing indigenous communities throughout the Amazon region. He had witnessed both successful adaptations and tragic losses of cultural integrity. The Kawahiva approach of careful evaluation and selective adoption had become a model that other communities wanted to learn from and adapt to their own circumstances. The village itself had evolved in fascinating ways. Traditional governance structures remained unchanged, but the community had developed new committees focused on external relations, technology evaluation, and cultural preservation. Young people who showed aptitude for working with outsiders received special training in languages, negotiation skills, and understanding of legal systems. However, not all changes have been positive or without controversy. Some tribal members, particularly among the middle-aged adults, felt that too much change was happening too quickly. They worried that the community's traditional way of life was being diluted by constant adaptation to outside pressures. These concerns came to a head during the dry season when James was approached by a group of conservative tribal members led by Nalu, Asha's father. They requested a community meeting to discuss what they saw as dangerous departures from traditional practices and values. The meeting that followed was one of the most intense discussions James had witnessed in the village. Conservative members argued that the community was losing its cultural identity through too much accommodation with outside influences. They pointed to changes in daily routines, the influence of new technologies, and the amount of time spent on external relations as evidence of cultural erosion. Progressive members, including many young people and some elders, argued that adaptation was necessary for survival and that the community had successfully maintained its core values while adopting beneficial innovations. They emphasized that all major decisions were still made through traditional consensus processes and that cultural practices remained strong. Asha found herself in a unique position during these discussions. As someone whose personal transformation had initiated many of the village's changes, she was seen as both a symbol of successful adaptation and a potential threat to traditional values. Her father's leadership of the conservative faction created personal tension that reflected the broader community divisions. James struggled with his own role in these debates. While he tried to remain neutral and facilitate discussion rather than advocate for particular positions, he realized that his presence and advice had influenced many of the changes that were now being questioned. He felt responsible for helping the community work through these tensions. The debate continued for several days, with different community members sharing their perspectives and concerns. Traditional storytellers recounted historical examples of how the tribe had dealt with previous challenges and changes. Spiritual leaders performed ceremonies designed to provide guidance from ancestral spirits about the proper path forward. During one particularly difficult session, an elderly woman named Kura shared a story that changed the direction of the discussions. She told about a time in her grandmother's generation when the tribe had faced a severe drought that threatened their survival. Traditional water sources had dried up, and conventional survival strategies were inadequate. According to the story, the tribe had been forced to venture into previously unexplored territory to find new water sources. This exploration had led them to discover new medicinal plants, different hunting grounds, and innovative techniques for water conservation. Most importantly, it had taught them that adaptation to new circumstances could strengthen rather than weaken their cultural identity. Kura's story helped community members understand that the current situation was not unprecedented. The tribe had always faced challenges that required adaptation and innovation. The question was not whether to change, but how to change in ways that honor traditional values while meeting contemporary needs. This shift in perspective allowed for more productive discussions about specific policies and practices. Instead of debating whether change was acceptable, the community began developing criteria for evaluating which changes were beneficial and which might be harmful to their cultural integrity. James contributed to these discussions by sharing examples of how other indigenous communities around the world had successfully maintained their cultural identity while adapting to modern circumstances. He emphasized that cultural preservation did not require complete isolation from the outside world, but rather thoughtful engagement that prioritized community values and decision-making autonomy. The resolution that emerged from these discussions was sophisticated and nuanced. The community established formal protocols for evaluating any proposed changes to traditional practices. These protocols included requirements for community consultation, spiritual guidance, trial periods for new practices, and regular reviews of adopted innovations. Most importantly, they decided to create a cultural preservation committee that would be responsible for documenting and protecting traditional knowledge while also overseeing the integration of new technologies and practices. This committee would include both conservative and progressive voices to ensure balanced decision-making. Asha was appointed to serve on this committee, representing the perspective of young people who had grown up during the period of rapid change. Her unique experience with cultural adaptation made her valuable in helping evaluate the long-term implications of different innovations. The establishment of these new governance structures marked a significant evolution in how the tribe approached cultural change. Rather than simply reacting to external pressures or internal divisions, they had developed systematic approaches for managing adaptation while preserving their core identity. As the community implemented these new structures, James began to consider his own future role. His relationship with the Kawahiva people had evolved far beyond his original research intentions. He had become deeply integrated into their community life and decision-making processes. However, he also recognized that his long-term presence might create dependencies that could be problematic for tribal autonomy. After extensive discussions with tribal leaders and his own academic advisors, James decided to gradually transition from full-time residence to periodic visits. This approach would maintain his availability as a cultural advisor while encouraging the community to develop greater independence in managing external relationships. The transition plan involved training several tribal members in skills that James had been providing, including legal advocacy, academic research methods, and intercultural communication. Asha and several other young adults showed particular aptitude for these roles and expressed interest in potentially pursuing formal education that would enhance their ability to serve their community. As James prepared for this transition, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple mirror given to a curious young girl. That moment of first self-recognition had initiated a series of changes that had ultimately strengthened the community's ability to navigate an increasingly complex world while maintaining their cultural integrity. The mirror that had started everything remained in Asha's possession, but it was no longer just a personal object. It had become a community symbol representing the balance between self-awareness and cultural belonging, between individual growth and collective responsibility, between tradition and innovation. On his final evening as a full-time village resident, James sat outside his cabin watching Asha demonstrate her latest mirror innovation to a group of children. She was teaching them how to use reflected light to create messages that could be seen across great distances, a skill that might prove valuable for future communication needs. As the children learned to manipulate light and shadow, creating patterns that carried meaning across the forest, James realized that he had witnessed something rare and precious, a community's successful adaptation to profound change without loss of essential identity. The young girl who had first seen herself in his mirror had become a leader in her community's ongoing story of cultural resilience and wisdom. The jungle around them continued its ancient rhythms, but within this small village, human beings had demonstrated their remarkable capacity for growth, adaptation, and preservation of what matters most. James knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, The Kawahiva people had developed the tools and wisdom necessary to meet them while remaining true to themselves. As stars appeared in the canopy overhead, James packed the last of his research notes and prepared for a new chapter in his relationship with this extraordinary community. The mirror that had reflected one girl's face had ultimately reflected the best qualities of human nature: curiosity, resilience, wisdom, and the ability to embrace change while honoring the past.